On today's show, the calendar has now flipped to the month of June. That means the NBA draft is very close. And today's podcast will be focused on the draft, on the rest of the Hawks roster decisions, your mailbag questions, and much more. And all of that is coming up.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1729 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday evening into Monday. And today's show is sponsored by the folks at LinkedIn Jobs to help you to find the most qualified candidates that you want to talk to and to help you to do it faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. Terms and conditions apply. I should also tell you at the top of the podcast to make us your first listen each and every day. Check us out and subscribe to the Locked On Hawks podcast anywhere you might find your podcasts. That includes Spotify and Apple and Overcast on the audio side, as well as YouTube on the video side. It's been very busy in this space, as you might expect. In the last several weeks, we've had a lot of guests, from Brian Schroeder to Bryce Simon to Bryce Hendricks, Robbie Callan, Wes Morton, Glenn Willis, Tyler Jones, and many more in the last few weeks only, and even more to come from here. The calendar is now set to June, and that means there's only a little bit more than 3 weeks until the NBA draft. It was time for a solo episode to sort of break up some of the guest stuff that I've been doing in recent days. Don't fear, more draft stuff, more guest opinions and all that stuff coming up in the next 3 weeks. But today's show is going to be a little bit of sort of the latest rumblings and intel and roundup stuff there, as well as your mailbag questions coming up on the podcast. But today we'll start with a little bit of draft intel. And Mark Stein had the first bit of what I would describe as actual reporting nationally on what the Hawks will do versus what they'll actually consider doing as far as analysis is concerned. Stein wrote about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago now, that the Hawks are, quote, increasingly expected to be choosing between two Frenchmen, Alex Sarr and Zachary Richichet, at number one overall. Since then, ESPN's Jonathan Givony has made sure to keep Donovan Clingan in the mix a few different times on his reporting. ESPN's latest big board update, actually, Givony said that there is chatter that Clingan, quote, has fans among the Hawks constituency, end quote. And Givony has also referenced Sarr, Richichet, Clingan, and trade opportunities as four options for the Hawks at the top of the draft. Also, just 2 days ago, as I'm recording this podcast on Friday, Givony wrote that the Hawks are, quote, at an early stage in its decision-making process, and there won't likely be clarity on which way the team is leaning with the pick until closer to draft night, end quote. Also, my friend Sam Vecini at The Athletic wrote, actually said on his podcast this week, that he believes there is a little bit more fluidity at number one than most people think at this point in time. And I won't do a full-on mock draft roundup right now, but a few different places have flipped to Richichet at the top spot. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but when the Hawks won the lottery, the default position of the mock draft community was basically the Hawks are a bit of a mixed bag, but everyone kind of put Alex Sarr number one. I should say everyone, but close to everyone. Since then, it's been a little bit more Richichet in the mix, most prominently from Givony and also John Wasserman of Bleacher Report. ESPN had Richichet in their top spot on Friday. Also, Givony wrote that, quote, barring a major surprise, it's unlikely that Richichet will drop out of the top two in the draft, with Washington picking after Atlanta. And of note there, Givony's actually had Richichet number one on his own board for a long time, so not a huge surprise that if without a ton of intel otherwise, he would put him in the top spot. But look, I would say overall, it's kind of what I've been talking about a lot on the show recently. The intel is still very spotty on the Hawks, and they're doing that maybe on purpose. And also, look, I know this is not a satisfying answer to fans, but this is not a team that was supposed to be picking up this high. And yes, it's been a little while, but also the Hawks they're really not incentivized to tell you anything about what they're actually thinking. Obviously, some of the reporting will certainly get ramped up now that the conference finals are over and the finals are approaching. More eyeballs on the draft as we get closer and closer. But right now, the intel is spotty. I do think that it would be a little bit of a surprise, maybe a bigger surprise than that, if it wasn't one of Sarr, Richichet, or Clingan at the top. And I also think Sarr and Richichet are considerably more likely to be the pick than Clingan is. There is a debate, and I certainly would not weigh in too hard on one side or the other here. But I think a lot of the analysts, public-facing, are a little bit higher on the Clingan fit, at least around the Hawks, than some of the national people that kind of do intel stuff. Clingan's been at least noted by ESPN and others, but it does seem like, according to Stein and what others have said and what I've heard, that it's probably going to be Sarr or Richichet if the Hawks are picking number one in later June. But still, I would say it's still quite open at this point in time. I got some questions about whether I was actually more confident now than a couple weeks ago about what the Hawks are going to do, and the answer is kind of not really. I would say I'm more confident that the pool is getting smaller. like I've referenced this before, but the last time there was a genuine surprise at number 1 overall was the Anthony Bennett draft. This is a year where I think it's going to be a little bit less surprising. Like, I won't say it's not going to happen, but it certainly would shock me a little bit if they got a total curveball, like someone like Castle or Holland or whatever. There's no buzz really about that right now, other than those top 3 guys in some order between Sarr, Shea, and Klingon. But I've been saying for a long time, and Hawks fans, I know a lot of people were kind of just selling Alex Sarr from the moment they won the lottery. I get that, but I've been saying since that day that it was never going to just be an easy pick. I know for some people it's seen as an easy pick. I won't try to talk you out of that. But as far as the league is concerned, as far as the Hawks are concerned, what I can gather, it's not some situation where they have a guy in his own tier. That's not how this is going to work. It would be easier if there was. It would also be more, like, obviously less fun if there was in some respects. But that's kind of the landscape right now, is what I would say at this point in time. And there's plenty more to get to, but it's coming. Is what I would say. Hold on tight. 3 weeks, and I do think that as the finals kind of begin, and there's a little bit less basketball to cover, some of the national insiders, the reporters, from everyone from Jake to Shams to Woj will start to kind of dial in a little bit more on the draft, and that usually means a little bit more intel coming out in the future. Elsewhere, there is a little bit of non-draft stuff. I'll go to one of those things right now. Mark Stein actually wrote about Jarrett Allen at one point in the last week or so, and then pivoted and said, quote, "Another center is likely bound for the trade market along with Allen this offseason, and that is Atlanta's Clint Capela." I will get to that more in a second when it comes to my fallout and my analysis of that quote-unquote rumor. But first, a word from our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Where you're hiring for a small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the roles that you have to offer. And that's why LinkedIn Jobs is the place to check out right now. They have the tools that you're looking for to find the right professionals for your team, and they help you to do it faster, and they help you to do it for free as well. I've been hiring people in the past for my day job, and really, LinkedIn Jobs has been huge, making the entire process easier and much more efficient. I know that small businesses are sometimes wearing different hats. It makes it difficult to have the time, resources that you need to hire. But LinkedIn is not just another job board. They have a network of more than 1 billion professionals. That makes it the best possible place to find somebody to hire. It gives you access to professionals that you can't find anywhere else. They do all that, by the way, while making the process easy and intuitive for you as well. Hiring is much easier for you when you have that many qualified candidates that are able to be reached. It is so easy. In fact, 86% of businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours of LinkedIn Jobs, and they help you make the entire process easier as well. 2.5 million small businesses are using LinkedIn Jobs for the hiring purposes right now. You can post your job for free by going to linkedin.com/lockedonnba. One more time, the place to go is linkedin.com/lockedonnba. Terms and conditions apply. All right, so I teased it out about Clint Capela being a guy who is potentially bound for the trade market, according to what Mark Stein reported. Normally, I would have done a little bit more urgent episode about that at some point when it comes to a trade rumor. And there's the reason why I didn't, basically. I said this on Twitter as well, but my response to that reporting from Mark Stein is essentially, duh. Now, that does not mean that the Hawks are going to trade Capela, but because I wouldn't say that. Like, I think it's not a lot that he's off the team, but he has been available in trade for about a year and a half, 2 years now. So it's not really breaking news that Clint's going to be available in trade. I've operated under that assumption for a long time. By the way, I would say the same thing or similarly for a report from Mike Scotto in the last week or so that talked about DeAndre Hunter being a name that rival executives are expecting to be available from the Hawks as well. I would say, yes, he is available. That does not mean he's going to be traded, but he's another guy who has been available for a long time now. And I think if you look where the Hawks are cap-wise, tax-wise, money-wise, and also roster-wise, it would be pretty weird if they weren't available on some level. Again, available does not mean urgently going to be traded, but I think everyone that follows the Hawks closely would certainly know that Capela and Hunter are at least going to be available for obvious reasons. So I'm sure I have some new listeners from previous times, so I'll expand a little bit here. I was not ignoring the intel or any like that. It's the correct reporting. I'm not bagging on Mark or Mike. They're right about this. It's just not new necessarily if you've been paying attention for a while. And to be clear again, doesn't mean that they're going to trade either one of those guys, but I will save the tax stuff for later on for the most part. But the Hawks do have 2 guys on their team that make $20+ million a year that are role players, and that's Capela and Hunter. So it shouldn't surprise anyone if they move one of them because of money stuff and also just logistically, but they were always going to be available, and that's why, just to answer a question that I got probably 5 times, why I didn't do an episode kind of reacting to those things, because they're not really new quote-unquote rumors. They're more like rumblings, and it's just kind of a, yeah, that's kind of going to be the case at this point in time. Elsewhere on the rumbling, rumor, reported stuff front, Ben Anderson, who's a Jazz guy at the radio station in Salt Lake City, essentially reported that the Jazz had some interest in Dejounte Murray back in February. I heard that at one point. I wasn't sure how serious it was personally, but also Danny Ainge, who is now the decision maker in Utah, is kind of infamous for being tied to guys, but also setting sky-high prices or not trying to pay full price if you're trying to acquire someone, etc. But anyway, Anderson basically said the Hawks wanted Keontae George in a deal for Dejounte, and Utah said no to that. It's not really worth litigating that rumor too much, but it's not a huge surprise to me that the Hawks would have asked for Keontae George because he is a young, talented, cheap player. But that was kind of out there, and then Dejounte himself put a bigger spotlight on the reporting because of what he said on social media. Forget the language. I'm going to read what Dejounte said. Quote, is Dejounte again speaking this on Twitter. Quote, don't believe everything you see on this dumbass internet. End quote. With all kinds of emojis as well. Of course, it's possible that talks with Utah did happen and never even got to Dejounte because players don't always know what's being discussed, nor do agents. But I thought it was at least kind of funny. People asked about it. So there you go. I'm not surprised on either side there. I think Dejounte, as I talked about a lot back in February, was very, very available in trade, and Utah calling makes some sense. The Hawks asking for Utah's best prospect makes some sense, and there you go. Christian Clark is another topic here who covers the Pelicans in New Orleans, has had some reporting on the Hawks stuff in recent days, got some attention from the aggregators in particular. He talked about previous discussions back in February between the Hawks and the Pelicans, which I talked about a lot on this podcast. That did happen. But then he touched on the potential for the sides to re-engage this summer. Now, that could obviously happen. It's possible. But where the attention kind of came in was that he wrote the following sentence, quote, even though Young is the more talented player, the Pelicans seem to hold more interest in Murray, league sources said, end quote. He then went on to note that Murray is cheaper, which is, of course, accurate, and also that, quote, the 6'5 Murray is not as much of a defensive liability as the 6'1 Young can be, end quote. So, for one, I would say the defensive gap between Trae Young and Dejounte Murray is a lot smaller than people nationally tend to paint it out to be. Part of that is that Dejounte is not as good as people think that he is defensively. He's not the guy he used to be defensively. He is better than Trae, to be clear, defensively. But reputation-wise, Dejounte's is overinflated and Trae is underinflated defensively. Now, Trae is not good on defense, but he's no longer the caricature of a bad defender that people kind of hold on to from earlier in his career. So the combination of those two things, those guys are a little bit closer than they were in the past. But anyway, Clark is a real beat writer who covers the team. It's believable that he is hearing the Pelicans are interested in Murray and not necessarily Young. That does not mean, by the way, that New Orleans believes that Murray is better than Young. I've seen that kind of translated different ways. No one reported that. No one said that. And I recommend thinking about the Pelican situation. So I talked about Brandon Ingram trades a lot earlier this summer, actually. But for one, keep in mind with all discussions around New Orleans involving Atlanta or otherwise, New Orleans has been a team that is firmly averse to paying the luxury tax. In fact, the Pelicans have quite literally never paid the luxury tax. Never once since it became a thing that existed more than 20 years ago. Not once. They do not pay the luxury tax. Obviously, I've made fun of the Hawks and their tax avoidance, but they have paid it in a small amount very, very long time ago. But still, New Orleans has never paid the tax. As such, Murray making $15 million less than Trae would matter a lot to New Orleans. Then you have to remember also, TJ McCollum has 2 more fully guaranteed seasons for about $60 million total. And from what I heard back in February, the Hawks weren't really interested in TJ. So nor should they be really at that number. It's a lot of money for him. He's a good player, but that's not a good contract. And he's also a pretty bad fit with Trae. But I would say it's possible the Pelicans think that Murray is a better fit with McCollum than Trae is. That makes some sense on some level. But they may also recognize at this point that it won't be super, super easy to move McCollum right now. So I'll stay with this for the most part. But I would just say this. I saw people misinterpreting this and misaggregating the report from Clark to say some things that he didn't actually say. So context is always important here. That's the usual these days. Unfortunately, some bad aggregation. But I do want to say context-wise that, like, yes, they could talk about a deal again that happened back in February involving Okongwu, involving Murray, involving whatever from Ingram on the New Orleans side could be in the mix here. Everyone always asks me if the Hawks could get in on Herb Jones and or Trey Murphy. I won't say it's impossible. I would say it's less likely because those guys are viewed. I'm not sure if they're untouchable by New Orleans, but they certainly are viewed as guys that they do not want to move, whereas Ingram might just have to be moved from New Orleans. But I covered that in detail back earlier in the offseason. One more question here from JC before we get to the next segment. And he actually asks, next time you do a mailbag podcast, I'd like you to discuss why Dereck Lively was profiled as a center last summer, but there is less certainty that Sarr can play center now. Good question here. I would say it's a good time also to plug something that I had nothing to do with at all, as not my thing to plug, but it was really interesting. So Sam Vecini, who is, I will raise my hand, I am friends with Sam, of The Athletic, did a 40-minute conversation with Alex Sarr on the Game Theory podcast, which is not only an interview with Alex Sarr, but also a film session. So I thought it was really informative. If you've watched him already, it's good to kind of see what he is saying, and a really good way to dive into Sarr if you've not been able to do that already, because I know it's not always easy to watch non-college players if you are more of a, casual draft observer. So that was a fun way to dive in on Alex Sarr and also have some commentary from Alex Sarr himself. Anyway, the short answer is to the question that Lively was always a center at every level. We never got official measurements for him at the combine because he didn't actually go to the combine. He wasn't required to at that point in time. The rule has changed since then. But the reporting was he might have like a 7'7" wingspan. That's pretty massive. He's even now listed at 7'1", 230. I won't do my rant about official measurements, but if that's true, he's probably a little bit bigger than Sarr, both in wingspan and sheer height. Also, Lively had 11% usage at Duke. He did basically nothing other than play finishing at the college level. He's shown more than that in the NBA level with some short roll stuff, but Lively was also a top 3 high school prospect in that class, and he was always playing center. He's never really been anything but a center at any point in time. Alex Sarr could play center. And I think people are going to have to figure out, and by people I mean the Hawks, whether they believe that he can or will play center in the future is a huge question overall about the evaluation there. But he has played a lot more on the perimeter in the past. Even this year at the NBL level, he's been more of a perimeter player than Lively ever really was. Sarr has the makings of a jumper in some ways. He's already taken those jump shots, some three-point shooting, already comfortable to some degree. Lively was a better rebounder at that point in time as well at the same age. Also had a top 5 block rate in the country in college in his one season. So obviously I understand the comp here because the listed measurements are pretty close together, and Lively's been a huge part of Dallas making the finals. So obviously he's really in the mix right now. But the reason why Sarr is viewed more as a combo big than Lively was is just the way he plays. Like in comparison to what Lively was doing, Sarr can still be a center. In fact, I still think he's probably going to be at least half the time a center. But it's really about role archetype. Like Lively was just always going to be a center. That's what he always was. He played there and didn't really show the kind of stuff on the perimeter that Sarr has shown. Plus, I think physically he's a little bit bigger, but Sarr, it could be a blessing and a curse to be able to do something on the perimeter. On the positive side for Sarr, if he can really improve that perimeter game with his jump shot, maybe a little bit of ball handling, attack closeouts, that becomes a hugely versatile and awesome skill set. On the negative side, if you become kind of a tweener that can't really do either one, that's not great. So anyway, I won't do another Sarr thing right now, but that's the difference, I think, is that just Lively's always been a center, and I think that he was viewed that way. And by the way, he fell to a late lottery because he kind of a weird season at Duke. He was really good at the very end of the season, but he was kind of a lost cause for like the first 3 months of the season at Duke, whereas Sarr was playing in the NBL against professionals, etc. But anyway, that is some differential, even if I understand why the question is being asked, and it's a very good sort of comparison point at this point. Whereas I think right now you probably are hearing more comparisons of Sarr to like Evan Mobley or guys who are like more of that tweener big, because that's kind of what Sarr has been to this point. All right. We have one more question at least to get to on this podcast today. But first, a word from our friends at eBay Motors. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors, and passion, drive, and patience are the formula for winning championships, and it keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and also level it up to peak performance. They have roof racks, they have exhaust kits, they have superchargers, LED headlights, and the list goes on and on and on. Whether you are into speed or power or style, eBay Motors has you covered across the board. They have over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, and you'll always find exactly what you're looking for in eBay Motors. And they have eBay Guaranteed Fit, which means your parts are guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money's coming back to you, because with eBay Motors, you are burning rubber, of course, but you are not burning any cash. With all the parts that you need at the prices that you're looking for, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win that you are seeking. Keep your ride or die alive right now at ebaymotors.com. One more time, the place to go is ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. All right, I got one more question here to answer before we get out of here on this Sunday into Monday. It comes from Morgan, who says, how did the 2021 Hawks compare with this current Pacers team? I find myself being aggravated by people just saying Indiana was better and has a brighter future than Atlanta did at that point. Thank you for the question. This was not the only one that I got in the same general vein, and I've seen the talking point quite a bit. By the way, the question came during the series. Now Indiana has lost to Boston in sweep fashion. But I think it's kind of two different topics. Number one, is which team was better in the moment and had the better run through the playoffs. Then you had number 2, as the question kind of got into from Morgan, which is basically which team has the brighter future between the two. Now, the first question, I think personally, it's pretty clear the Hawks actually had the better, more impressive run 3 years ago than Indiana's was this year. And they were probably the better team of the two at the time. I won't give you the full picture here, but just a few notes here. They had almost the same exact overall record and net rating in the full seasons. Now, 2021 was a shortened season. There was 10 fewer games. So I'm using win percentage there. But also, the 2021 Hawks had the best record in the Eastern Conference over the second half plus of the year. They were 27-11 in a 72-game season. So that's more than half the season. They finished 27-11. That's the best record in the league. Sorry, the best record in the East during that sample size at the end of the year. Then they soundly beat the Knicks in 5 games without home court in the first round. Then they beat the number 1 seed Sixers and won a game 7 on the road in that series. And crucially, the Knicks and Sixers were much, much, much healthier than the opponents that Indiana beat. Then the Hawks took 2 games. People kind of memory hold this or whatever. The Hawks beat the Bucks twice in the conference finals. Now, they lost the series. Of course, there was the injury to Trae, injury to Giannis, etc. But the Hawks won a game at home and a game in Milwaukee in that series. So they were competitive. You can certainly debate how close it was. Hawks fans might have one opinion, but I'm just saying, objectively speaking, they won 2 games in the series, including a road game in Milwaukee. In comparison, Indiana had a much, much easier road through the playoffs and didn't have the same metrics down the stretch of the season that the Hawks did over, again, like a 40-game sample size. For instance, Indiana beat Milwaukee, yes, in the playoffs this year, but with no Giannis the entire series, and Dame missed 2 of the 6 games. So that was the zombie Bucks, basically, without Giannis. Then they beat the Knicks with OG playing 3 of 7 games, Mitchell Robinson playing 1 of 7 games, no Bogdanovich, Josh Hart was hobbling at the end of the series, Jalen Brunson broke his hand in game 7. All those things happened. Then they probably should have won a game against Boston. It was actually crazy that it actually got swept in that series, but they didn't. They got swept, and that was Boston without Porzingis, who is a top 3 player on their roster according to most people. So it's pretty obvious to me the run was less impressive. Indiana went on. They won fewer games. They beat worse opponents. There was nothing close to what the Hawks did against Philadelphia, beating an Embiid-led Philadelphia team on the road in a game 7 and winning that series. So there's that. Now, you could say Indiana's second best player, Pascal Siakam, is more famous, more prominent than what the Hawks had in that number 2 spot that year. But that Hawks team had a peak Clint Capela, which, by the way, I know people don't like Clint now, but if you were there or watched that series or watched the numbers or anything like that, he was probably a top 40 player in the league that season. I argued at the time he was the second best defender in the entire league that year behind Rudy Gobert. He was that good. Plus they had Bogey in the middle of an absolute career heater for about 40 games, plus John Collins, plus Kevin Huerter, who won a game 7 on the road basically for them in Philadelphia, Gallinari, et cetera, et cetera. And the Hawks also did all of that without really anything from DeAndre Hunter, who got hurt after, I think, 3 games in the playoffs and missed the entire rest of the way. So, people have kind of, again, memory hold how well that team was playing. I understand always why people think of that team as kind of a fluke or whatever. I never really bought that all the way, but regardless, there was a 3-month record at that Hawks team playing incredibly well. It was not just like they had won a playoff upset against Philadelphia. They had been playing at a top 2 seed level basically for 3 months. Anyway, the second part of the question is far less clear. And that's obviously colored by the fact that the Hawks have been pretty mediocre since then. It's always hard to evaluate, in the moment compared to what you've already seen when it comes to future facing versus what's already happened, which is where we are right now. Indiana is future facing. The Hawks already didn't live up to the billing, basically. So people had trouble isolating how well that team was actually playing because of what happened after the fact. It's easier to call it a fluke, but you won't get the same pushback. But we'll see how Indiana plays. I think a lot of people are talking about how much better they are than the Hawks team. That's pretty silly. And they're doing so pretty flippantly because of what the Hawks have become, not because of what happened in the moment. I won't do the Halliburton versus Trae comparison, who's better or whatever. We could just say that that's a comparable thing. Halliburton's their best player, point guard. Hawks' best player is Trae, point guard, all that stuff. I think Trae was playing at a better level. And by the way, unequivocally, Trae had a much, much better playoff run than Halliburton did in that same season. Not even close. People have kind of forgotten how good Trae was in that playoff run. Anyway, Indiana does have, again, and this is, as I said before, the second big name star in Siakam. The Hawks didn't really ever have that guy. But Pascal's already 30 years old. He'll probably get a little bit worse from here. you have to say, just based on the aging curve that most guys have. And I think people are probably a little bit too high on the supporting players for Indiana right now, whether it be, Nembhard or, whoever. They don't have guys that blow you away. Miles Turner is a really good third player, I will say, but like their 4, 5, 6 guys are not like going to blow you away necessarily compared to what the Hawks had at that point in time. So this is already too long, but I would say this. I would firmly back the 21 Hawks in a battle of how the teams were actually playing in that moment and which team was playing better and had a more impressive run. For me, that's not particularly close, given that Indiana didn't. Look, it's not their fault, by the way, just to be very clear. You can't control who you play. So Indiana won the series. They beat Milwaukee when they should have, because without Giannis and without Dame for part of the series, Indiana was the better team, and they won the series. New York, similar thing. Like, they were so banged up by the end of that series that, yeah, Indiana probably should have won. They did. But credit where credit's due. They won the series. But all that said, like, I think people have kind of forgotten how good that Hawks team was in the moment and how competitive that conference finals run was compared to Indiana getting swept when they got there. So the other half of this question is harder to answer. We can't really know. Growth is not linear. That's a thing that I stole from my friend Robbie Callan for years. But growth and progression for young players and young teams is not linear. It never is. Well, shouldn't it never? Mostly it never is. And as always, people are kind of forgetting that right now about Indiana. There's always a team that kind of breaks out a little bit early, and we'll see. It's basically a TBD. It might happen. Maybe they'll prove me wrong. Maybe they'll be better in the future. But in the moment, I think if you were just looking what the teams did for basically the final 40 games of that season and into the playoffs and who had a better run, the Hawks were pretty clearly superior in the metrics, in the eye test, in the opponents, all those things. So I'm sure Locked On Pacers and my guy Tony East will not like this if they hear it, but alas, that's my truth on this podcast on a Sunday into Monday. All right, that's all I have on today's podcast. Please subscribe to the show anywhere you might find your podcast. I will again plug. We've had tons of awesome guests on the draft in particular in recent days. Just a few of them here. Brian Schroeder's been great on the show. Bryce Simon was a huge hit. Bryce Hendricks. I had Robbie Callan on the podcast. Always a great guest. Wes Moore and Glenn Willis, who cover the Hawks regularly. Tyler Jones, always a fan favorite. Lots and lots more coming, but certainly if you missed any of that, it is all worth listening to, and nothing is really outdated. Everything else is kind of up to date right now from the summer because there hasn't been huge news. So go ahead and listen, subscribe. YouTube likes and comments, always appreciated. 5-star ratings and reviews as well. Please tell a friend about the show, maybe 2 friends or 3 friends or family members or whatever. It's been huge to have some support this summer. I definitely appreciate that, but let's just take advantage of this moment and grow the fan base, grow the podcast, all that fun stuff. I appreciate all that as well. Please follow the show as well on Twitter/X at Locked On Hawks. I can be found on that website /app at BT Rowland. I also do a Patreon in which I do some extra Hawks coverage, some Braves coverage, etc. If you want to support my Atlanta sports work, all that can be found at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I definitely appreciate all the support there as well. Anyway, that's all I have. Thanks for listening to the show, everybody. We'll have much, much more later on this week. And we'll see you all next time.